We're talking about a fascinating new documentary from CBS Reports exploring the American bison's return from the brink of extinction. 100 years ago, the iconic bison were overhunted and nearly wiped out as a result.
Now, my children and my grandchildren are able to witness them being on our homeland.
In 2009, scientists released 23 bison into a barren Mexican desert. Ranchers called it reckless. Officials predicted they would starve. The landscape was nothing but thorns and silence. But 10 years later, something incredible happened. The desert transformed into a thriving ecosystem in ways no one saw coming. The broken prairie. Let's go back to understand why this moment mattered so much. Historically, bison roamed across North America in truly massive numbers. Between 30 and 60 million of these animals moved through the continent, including parts of northern Mexico. They traveled in herds that stretched for miles. Their presence shaped everything around them. When they grazed, they created patterns in the grasslands. When they moved, they opened pathways for countless other species. Then came the hunters and settlers. By the late 1800s, relentless hunting and habitat destruction had decimated the population. Fewer than 550 wild bison remained alive in the United States. In Mexico, the situation was even worse. Bison went completely extinct in the region, from millions down to nothing. The great herds that once thundered across the landscape were gone. When the bison disappeared, the land began to die with them. The ecological collapse was dramatic and devastating. Without bison moving across the terrain, the soil became hard and compacted. Rain couldn't soak into the ground anymore. It just ran off the surface, carrying away precious topsoil. Invasive thorn bushes moved in, choking out native grasses and wildflowers. Streams that had flowed year-round began drying up. The water cycle had been disrupted. Prairie dogs vanished from their burrows. Black-footed ferrets, which depended on prairie dogs for food and shelter, disappeared too. Burrowing owls had nowhere to nest. The entire web of life unraveled thread by thread. The Chihuahuan Desert, which spans parts of Mexico and the southwestern United States, including New Mexico, became a landscape of thorns and silence. What had once been productive grassland turned into barren wasteland. Local communities tried to fix it. They planted grass seeds. They built irrigation systems. They brought in equipment to break up the soil. Nothing worked. Every human attempt to restore the area failed to make a lasting impact. For over a century, people assumed this damage was permanent. The desert had taken over, and there seemed to be no way back. That's why the announcement in 2009 seemed so unbelievable to most people. Against this backdrop of failure and devastation, a group of scientists made a decision that seemed absolutely insane. The 2009 decision. When conservationists announced they were releasing bison into the Chihuahuan Desert, specifically in the Llanos Biosphere Reserve area of Chihuahua, Mexico, the response was immediate and harsh. People thought they had lost their minds. The landscape looked nothing like bison habitat. There were no rolling green prairies, no abundant water sources, just arid shrublands, scattered thorny vegetation, and endless stretches of hardpan soil. The Chihuahuan Desert is one of the driest regions in North America. Summer temperatures soar above 100 degrees. Winter nights can drop below freezing. Rain is unpredictable and scarce. When it does come, it often arrives in violent storms that wash away topsoil rather than nourishing it. Looking at this harsh environment, critics saw only one possible outcome: disaster. These were grassland animals. How could they possibly survive in a desert of thorns? Local ranchers were particularly vocal in their opposition. They worried about competition for the limited grazing land their cattle needed. Some called the plan reckless and predicted the herd would starve within months. But the scientists behind the project knew something important. Historical records showed that bison had actually ranged through the northern Chihuahuan Desert from around AD 700 all the way to the 19th century. These animals weren't strangers to the region. They had lived here before. A small cross-border herd called the Llanos Hidalgo herd had even persisted since the 1920s, moving between Mexico and the United States. The land remembered the bison, even if people had forgotten. The scientists believed that if given the chance, the ecosystem could remember too. They just needed to reintroduce the missing piece. In 2009, they did exactly that. 23 bison, sourced from U.S. populations, were transported to the barren grasslands and released. No feeding stations were set up, no fences were built to protect them, no backup plan was put in place. The animals were essentially left to fend for themselves in what many observers called a wasteland. The gamble was enormous, and everyone was watching to see if it would pay off. The plan was audacious, but it was built on solid scientific principles that most people didn't understand yet. The project framework. The reintroduction was spearheaded by conservation organizations working in partnership with Mexican wildlife authorities. Their goal was ambitious: create a self-sustaining bison herd that could help restore the degraded Chihuahuan desert ecosystem. They wanted to test whether bison could still play their historical role as ecosystem engineers in this harsh environment. The philosophy behind the project was radical for its time. Instead of managing the bison like livestock, the team decided to let them be completely wild. No supplemental feeding during tough seasons, no controlled breeding programs, no routine veterinary care. The bison would have to survive on their own, just as their ancestors had for thousands of years. This hands-off approach was based on scientific understanding of how bison interact with their environment. These animals aren't just big grazers that eat grass and move on. They fundamentally reshape the landscape around them through their daily activities. When bison walk, their heavy hooves break up hard soil crusts. This seems like a small thing, but in desert environments, it's crucial. Compacted soil prevents water from infiltrating into the ground. When rain falls on hard soil, it just runs off the surface. But when bison hooves crack that crust, they create pathways for water to sink deep into the earth. Bison also create wallows. These are shallow depressions where they roll around in the dirt to cool off, remove parasites, and mark territory. These wallows become catch basins for rainwater. After storms, they hold water longer than the surrounding landscape. Seeds collect in these damp spots and germinate. Tiny wetland pockets form, supporting insects, amphibians, and birds. The waste bison leave behind acts as natural fertilizer. Their manure is rich in nitrogen and other nutrients that plants need. As it breaks down, it feeds the soil microbes that form the foundation of healthy ecosystems. Studies would later show that bison manure increased soil nitrogen levels by about 40% in grazed areas. Perhaps most importantly, bison roam constantly. Unlike cattle, which tend to settle in one area and graze it down to nothing, bison are nomadic. They move from place to place, never staying long enough to destroy the vegetation. This gives plants time to recover and prevents overgrazing. Seeds stuck to their fur spread across the landscape as they migrate, naturally replanting areas. The scientists believed that if these natural behaviors could happen freely, the bison might trigger what ecologists call a trophic cascade. This is when the reintroduction of one key species creates ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem, bringing back multiple other species and processes. But believing in a theory and proving it are two different things. As the 23 bison wandered into the desert, the real test began. Not everyone saw the genius in this approach. In fact, most people thought it was dangerous and doomed. Initial opposition and concerns. The criticism of the project was intense and immediate. Local ranchers saw the bison as direct competition for scarce resources. In the Chihuahuan desert, grazing land is limited and precious. Ranchers held leases on much of the land, and their cattle operations depended on access to every available blade of grass. Introducing wild bison into this equation seemed like a threat to their livelihoods. There were also legitimate concerns about disease transmission. Bison can carry various pathogens that might spread to cattle. If the wild herd made domestic livestock sick, It could devastate the local economy. Ranchers had seen similar problems in other areas where wildlife and cattle mixed. Beyond practical concerns, there was a deeper philosophical opposition. To many locals, the project felt like outsiders imposing their vision on a community that had lived in the region for generations. The cattle ranching culture had deep roots. Bringing back bison seemed like an attempt to erase that culture and return to some romanticized past. Some critics pointed out the irony of the situation. Bison are considered native wildlife in Mexico and receive legal protection as such. But across the border in the United States, they're often classified as livestock and don't receive the same protections. This inconsistency created confusion and legal complications, especially for the cross-border Llanos Hidalgo herd that had been moving between the two countries since the 1920s. Environmental skeptics had their own doubts. They looked at the barren landscape and simply couldn't see how 23 animals could make any difference. The desert had been degraded for over a century. Human attempts with modern technology had failed. What could a handful of bison possibly accomplish? Even some conservationists privately worried the project was too ambitious. 23 animals seemed like such a small number. One bad drought, one harsh winter, one disease outbreak, and the entire herd could be wiped out before it had a chance to establish itself. The tension was real, and the stakes were high. When those 23 bison walked into the desert, they carried the weight of a controversial experiment on their backs. For the first few years, it looked like the critics might be proven right. Despite the criticism and doubts, the scientists pressed forward, and then something strange happened. Nothing seemed to happen at all. The quiet years. After the release, the bison essentially vanished into the vast desert landscape. There was no media circus following their progress. No tourist industry sprung up around them. No viral videos captured their movements. For most people, the story ended the day the animals were released. Behind the scenes, scientists monitored the herd when they could, but tracking animals in such remote and rugged terrain was challenging. The bison moved constantly, appearing in one area and then disappearing for weeks. Their behavior was unpredictable. They wandered into areas that seemed to offer little food or water. Sometimes they split into smaller groups. Other times they gathered together. The early population numbers were discouraging. Growth was slow. Some calves didn't survive their first year. The herd remained small, hovering close to the original 23 animals. To outside observers, it looked like the bison were barely hanging on, just barely surviving in an environment too harsh for them. Reports from the field painted a grim picture. The animals looked thin during dry seasons. They traveled long distances searching for food. Some ranchers reported seeing lone bison wandering far from the core territory, as if lost. Behind closed doors, some officials began questioning whether they should intervene or even end the experiment. But nature doesn't work on human timelines. While people worried and doubted, something subtle was happening on the ground. The bison were adapting. More importantly, they were working. Field researchers who spent time in the area began noticing small changes. In places where bison had grazed and moved through, the soil looked different. It was darker, softer, less compacted. After rainstorms, water seemed to pool in certain areas rather than running off immediately. Tiny green shoots appeared in the wallows and along bison trails. These signs were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. They weren't dramatic, but they hinted at something important. The ecosystem was responding to the bison's presence. The healing process had begun, just very slowly and quietly. Year by year, the changes accumulated. What started as barely noticeable differences became patterns. The patterns became trends, and the trends became transformation. But beneath the surface, invisible to the casual observer, something extraordinary was beginning to unfold. The transformation. As the project reached its 5th year and then moved toward its 10th, the truth became impossible to deny. The bison weren't just surviving, they were thriving. the population began to grow steadily. From 23 animals, the herd expanded to 50, then 100, then 150. By around 2019, roughly 10 years after the initial release, the population had grown to over 200 bison. This growth wasn't just about more animals being born. It was about calves surviving at high rates. It was about adult bison staying healthy even through droughts. The land was improving, and the animals reflected that improvement. But the real shock came from what was happening to the desert itself. Aerial photographs and satellite imagery told an incredible story. Areas that had been photographed in 2009, showing bare soil and scattered thorns, looked completely different by 2019. The same locations were now covered in grass. Green had replaced brown across large swaths of territory. Native grasses that hadn't been seen in decades returned. After rains, instead of the ground staying barren, wildflowers bloomed in brilliant displays of color. The desert was remembering what it had been before the bison disappeared over a century earlier. The changes went far beyond just plants. Water behavior transformed dramatically. Studies showed that in areas where bison regularly moved, water absorption into the soil increased significantly. Rain that would have once run off immediately, causing erosion, now soaked into the ground. This recharged underground water tables. Streams that had dried up every year began holding water longer into the dry season. Some flowed year-round for the first time in living memory. The soil itself became healthier. Tests showed that nitrogen levels, which are crucial for plant growth, increased by about 40% in areas where bison grazed regularly. The bison weren't depleting the soil. They were enriching it. Their manure provided fertilizer. Their hooves created aeration. Their grazing stimulated new growth. With better soil and more water came an explosion of biodiversity. Prairie dogs returned to areas they had abandoned decades earlier. These small rodents are keystone species themselves. Their burrows aerate the soil even more. Their digging brings up nutrients. Their colonies create habitat for dozens of other species. Following the prairie dogs came black-footed ferrets, one of North America's most endangered mammals. These ferrets depend almost entirely on prairie dogs for food and use their burrows for shelter. Their return signaled that the ecosystem was truly recovering. Burrowing owls appeared, nesting in abandoned prairie dog burrows. Quail populations increased. Foxes and coyotes found more prey. Frogs and toads bred in the seasonal pools created by bison wallows. Raptors like hawks and eagles had more hunting opportunities with the return of small mammals. Even larger animals responded to the changes. Antelope populations in the region increased. The improved grasslands provided better nutrition. The increased water availability supported more wildlife across the board. All of this happened because of how bison interact with their environment. Their constant movement prevented overgrazing. While cattle might stay in one area until they've eaten everything, bison roamed continuously. They grazed an area lightly and then moved on, giving the plants time to recover. This pattern mimicked the natural grazing that had shaped these grasslands for thousands of years. Their hooves continued to play a crucial role. Every step broke up hard soil crust. In desert environments, this crust forms a barrier that can prevent rain from penetrating. By constantly breaking it up, the bison created pathways for water to reach plant roots and recharge groundwater. The wallows they created became miniature ecosystems of their own. Water collected in these depressions after storms. Seeds that had been dormant in the soil for years suddenly had the moisture they needed to germinate. Insects came to the water. Birds came to eat the insects and drink. Amphibians laid eggs. Each wallow became a small oasis. Seeds stuck to bison fur as they brushed against plants. As the animals wandered miles across the landscape, they carried those seeds and deposited them in new locations. This natural seed dispersal helped plants colonize areas that had been barren. The transformation was real, measurable, and undeniable. After 10 years, the Chihuahuan Desert had changed from a degraded wasteland into a functioning ecosystem, and the bison had made it happen. The results spoke louder than any argument ever could, and minds began to change across the region. Changing attitudes. The evidence forced even the harshest critics to reconsider their positions. Ranchers who had predicted failure now saw thriving grasslands adjacent to their properties. Some noticed that their own cattle seemed healthier when grazing near bison-recovered areas. The improved soil and vegetation benefited everyone. Scientists who had been skeptical began publishing papers about the remarkable recovery. Aerial comparisons showing the before and after transformation were striking. The data was clear. Bison had reversed decades of desertification more effectively than any human intervention had managed. Local communities that had initially opposed the project started seeing benefits. The restored land was more productive. The increased biodiversity brought ecological stability. Some ranchers began supporting cooperative management approaches that allowed both bison and cattle to share the landscape. The success in Llanos caught attention across borders. In 2020, building on what had been learned, conservationists released 19 bison into Coahuila's El Carmen Nature Reserve to create a second conservation herd. The model was being replicated because it worked. Cultural attitudes shifted as well. For many Mexican communities, the return of bison represented a reconnection with history. These animals had been part of the landscape for centuries before being wiped out. Their return wasn't just ecological restoration. It was cultural restoration too. Wildlife managers and conservation organizations around the world took notice. The Llanos Project became a case study in successful rewilding. Here was proof that introducing a keystone species could trigger ecosystem-wide recovery, similar to what had been observed with wolves in Yellowstone. The transformation went from controversial experiment to conservation blueprint in just 10 years. What started as one controversial experiment in Mexico would go on to reshape conservation thinking worldwide. Broader impact and legacy. The success of the Chihuahuan Desert bison reintroduction rewrote assumptions about ecosystem restoration. For decades, the standard approach had been human-intensive. If you wanted to restore degraded land, you brought in bulldozers, irrigation systems, and crews to plant native species. It required constant maintenance and significant funding. The Bison Project proved that nature could do the heavy lifting if given the right tools. Reintroducing a keystone species and then stepping back allowed natural processes to rebuild the ecosystem. The approach was low cost and low intervention, yet it delivered results that expensive human programs had failed to achieve. This success gave credibility to rewilding as a conservation strategy. Other regions began exploring similar approaches with different keystone species. The concept of letting ecosystems heal themselves gained mainstream acceptance in conservation circles. The project also highlighted the resilience of nature. The Chihuahuan Desert had been degraded for over a century. Most people assumed that level of damage was permanent, but the land still held the memory of what it had been. It still contained seeds waiting for the right conditions. It still had the potential to recover. All it needed was the return of the species that had once kept it healthy. For indigenous and local communities across North America, the bison's success reinforced traditional ecological knowledge. Many Native American tribes had long maintained that bison were essential to prairie health. The Llanos Project provided scientific validation of what indigenous peoples had always known. The story also offered an important lesson about patience. The first few years showed little obvious progress. Only by maintaining the project through uncertainty did the transformation become visible. In a world that demands immediate results, the bison experiment demonstrated that some solutions require long-term commitment. Challenges remain, of course. Poaching continues to threaten the herd. The legal status of bison differs between Mexico and the United States, creating management complications. Competition with cattle ranching persists as a source of tension. Climate change adds new uncertainties. But the fundamental success cannot be denied. A handful of bison, released into a barren desert with no support, transformed the landscape into a thriving ecosystem. They proved that keystone species can heal damaged habitats. They showed that nature, when given a chance, knows how to restore itself. From 23 animals in a barren wasteland to a blueprint for healing the planet, the bison had proven nature's power to restore itself. In 2009, scientists released 23 bison into a lifeless Mexican desert. 10 years later, over 200 bison roamed restored grasslands. Prairie dogs, ferrets, owls, and countless other species returned. Streams flowed again. The desert remembered how to be alive. Nature proved it can heal itself when we give it the right tools. If this story amazed you, subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below. Do you think we should try this in more places?